The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, thank you so much. I rise to join my colleagues. Really appreciate my colleague from Hawaii's leadership on this topic and the senator from New Hampshire to talk about the pending discussion about the budget reconciliation bill and the vote-a-rama that will start in a few hours. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues for joining me to pass Senate Joint Resolution 37 2 days ago, the resolution that I had to challenge President Trump's Canadian tariffs, a horrible idea, and we were able to get 51 votes in this chamber. It was a privileged motion. Majority was sufficient to pass it, to turn off the Canadian tariffs because they hurt consumers, they hurt businesses, they hurt farmers, and they also hurt our national security by raising the price of aluminum and steel. 35% of the aluminum and steel that go into U.S. ships and subs comes from Canada, the other 65% from the United States. It was an important bill to pass because we don't need to put an additional sales tax on goods purchased by Americans that come from Canada. We don't need to inspire a Canadian retaliation against American products. And finally, we need to send the message we understand that Canada is not an adversary, but Canada is a friend. That bill passed the Senate on to the House. We're already working on the House side to see if we can get it passed there. But today, what I want to do is address not the Canadian tariffs that were announced now months ago, but the new, quote, reciprocal tariffs that President Trump announced on Wednesday in the South Lawn at the very moment that we were voting to overturn the Canadian tariffs. President Trump deemed these tariffs as, quote, reciprocal tariffs, but I got another phrase for them. They are economic idiocy. And I want to talk about why they are so bad, why the policy is bad, and when the policy is so bad and seemingly inexplicable, something else is going on, and I want to conclude by focusing on what that something else is. Mr. President, I went to the University of Missouri and I majored in economics, and I had some amazing professors, and I just want to give them a shout out. John Coolman, Whitney Hicks, Walter Johnson, Ron Roddy. I had some amazing professors at Mizzou. I graduated with an honors degree in economics in 1979, and if they were standing here with me, they would say, Tim Kaine, you are my student. I hope you remember what we talked about in these economic classes, and they would point out what I'm about to point out, why these tariffs announced broadly against virtually every nation in the world at the say-so of one person, a national sales tax falling on American consumers at the say-so of one person, why they are in fact economic idiocy. They will hurt our families, they will hurt our businesses, they will hurt our farmers, and all the economic signs suggest that President Trump is flipping the world's strongest economy toward recession. When we were kids, we all learned the fairy tale, I think it's a Grimm Brothers fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, the mysterious figure that turned straw into gold. What we are now seeing is Trumpelstiltskins turning gold into straw. President Trump started with the strongest economy in the world the day he was inaugurated. A strong stock market, strong consumer confidence, strong growth rates and growth projections, manufacturing up, infrastructure up, America building again. And in 2 months, his chaotic economic idiocy has turned it around where the American economy, just go turn on the TV right now and look what's happening in the markets. The American economy has nothing but red lights and question marks all over it because of the economic idiocy. Economic idiocy is a strong charge for me. I'm not one to do a lot of name calling, but that's exactly what this is. And let me focus on some examples from President Trump's Wednesday announcement that show how idiotic these tariffs are. Japan and South Korea, two great allies of the United States. We have been working very carefully to deepen the relationship they have with each other and with us to check against the nation that we all in this chamber and President Trump also views as our chief adversary, China. President Trump, on his Wednesday announcement, imposes a 24% tariff on goods coming from South Korea and a 25% tariff on goods coming from Japan. This is no way to treat a friend. And guess what these friends are doing? They met with China to talk about a free trade agreement. They met with China to talk about how they need to band together to protect themselves from the economic policy of the United States. Japan and South Korea are two of the best allies we have in Asia or anywhere in the world. And the relationships we have had with both nations have been very strong, whether it's military to military cooperation, trade, diplomacy, work together on humanitarian issues, on educational exchanges. Donald Trump's tariffs are chasing Japan and South Korea into China's arms. Idiocy. Here's one, Mr. President. Israel is an ally and Iran is an adversary. I think we could get a 100-0 vote on that proposition in this chamber. Israel is an ally, Iran is an adversary. Guess what President Trump did with his tariffs on Wednesday? A 17% tariff on Israel and Iran, 10% tariff. 17% tariff on our ally Israel and Iran, 10% tariff. What kind of friend is that? How is that as a way to treat an ally? We are rock solid in sending military support to Israel. I helped whip votes almost exactly a year ago in the Senate floor to get a $14 billion defense aid package for Israel. But we're going to put a higher tariff on Israel than on Iran? It makes no sense. It's idiocy. Here's another one. Trump says these are reciprocal tariffs. We are putting tariffs on nations who are treating us unfairly in trade. But he's imposing tariffs even on nations that put no tariffs on U.S. products, that have no trade barriers on U.S. products. Singapore has no trade barriers on U.S. products, but Trump is socking them with tariffs anyway. Israel has no trade barriers on U.S. products, but Trump is socking them with tariffs anyway. Idiocy. Idiocy. Here's another one. Trump, in his rambling monologue on the South Lawn on Wednesday, where he defined groceries as a bag with stuff in it, I was very happy to be enlightened about what groceries are. He said that he was imposing tariffs on nations where the U.S. has trade deficits. So the idea is we're going to put tariffs on them because you're not buying enough of our stuff. We want to penalize nations with trade where the U.S. has a trade deficit. But guess what? We have trade surpluses with Brazil, Australia, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, Singapore, and the UK. So what did Donald Trump do? He put tariffs on them anyway. He said it was about trade deficits, and he's putting tariffs even on nations that are buying more of our products than we're buying of theirs. Idiocy. Idiocy. In Donald Trump's first term, he encouraged American businesses to move their supply chains out of China. And a lot of businesses did. Many American businesses followed Donald Trump's instructions and moved their supply chains from China to Vietnam. And in President Trump's first term, he boasted about that. He patted himself on the back. I told these American companies, pull your supply chain out of China. And when they went to Vietnam, he patted himself on the back about that. So what's he doing now? 46% tariff on imports from Vietnam. Well, that's quite a way to treat American companies that move their supply chains out of China at your request just a few years ago. Some moved their supply chains to nations like Cambodia or other nearby nations. Trump socked them all. He socked them all with tariffs, even for these businesses who did move their supply chains at his request. And then we get to something that has been more widely known. Trump putting tariffs on tiny, nearly uninhabited islands. Reunion, the Heard and McDonald Islands, Norfolk Island. There is a tiny French island off the coast of Canada that I will admit I was not even aware of. St. Pierre and Miquelon, 50% tariff on these places. I mean, I will say one thing about Donald Trump's tariffs that's good, and it's the only thing that's good. It's made a lot of people pull out their globe and look at nations that they didn't even know existed. St. Pierre and Miquelon will now have a 50% tariff. Heard and McDonald Islands, a 10% tariff. Svalbard and Jan Mayen, which are actually not even a country, it's part of Norway, a 10% tariff. Norfolk Island, a 29% tariff. Reunion, 37% tariff. Donald Trump at least has inspired interest in geography, a subject that often kids find boring. Okay, so I've gone through these examples of pure idiocy. The tariffs are not designed to punish adversaries, since we are hurting allies and treating them worse than adversaries in many ways. The tariffs are not designed to lower trade barriers, since nations with no trade barriers are still getting socked. The tariffs are not designed to counter trade deficits, since nations where we have trade surpluses are getting socked. So why do them at all? Why punish Americans with a national sales tax, which all the economists say is the largest peacetime tax ever imposed in U.S. history? If it's not to reduce trade barriers, if it's not to punish nations with trade deficits, if it's not designed to punish nations that are adversaries, why would we impose a sales tax on the American consumer, the American family, American businesses, American national security? That's what we're going to be talking about tonight during the Vote-A-Rama. That's what you will see Democrats emphasizing with amendments that we are offering. These tariffs are not about trade deficits, trade barriers. They're not about the behavior of adversaries. It's about raising money to fund a tax cut for the rich. That's what they're about. Peter Navarro, the president's chief economic advisor, says, and I think this is probably optimistic, but these guys like to puff up the numbers. He says that these tariffs will raise $6 trillion over the course of the next 10 years, about $600 billion. All taken out of the pockets of everyday Americans who are paying more for groceries, who are paying more for building supplies when they do a home renovation, farmers who are paying more from fertilizer because the key component, potash, 80% of it comes from Canada. The $6 trillion that these tariffs will raise all come out of the pocketbooks of Americans who are working hard and who don't want to pay more taxes. But they're going to fork over $6 trillion because of these tariffs. And then President Trump and my colleagues here are setting up a budget where they'll take that $6 trillion and they'll add to it all of these slash and burn cuts that chainsaw-wielding Elon Musk are finding by laying off 80,000 people at the VA or indiscriminately firing veterans in every agency in the federal government. They'll combine the tariff revenue with the savings from Medicaid cuts or cuts to school nutrition or cuts to the Pell Grant program, and then they will take all of that revenue and hand it over to the richest people in this country, many of whom are the richest people on the planet Earth, in tax cuts for the wealthiest. How do we know? How do we know to predict that? We know because that's what they did when Donald Trump was president in 2017. In 2017, the tax bill that passed by a simple majority vote in this body was a big giveaway to the rich, and that's what Trump and my Republican colleagues are preparing to do yet again. The only difference between 2017 and now is this: In 2017, when the Republicans, Donald Trump, gave a tax cut to the rich, they didn't pay for it. It was all on the deficit. They just put it on the credit card for our kids and grandkids to pay. This time, they've decided they don't want to continue to jack up the deficit, although they're likely to anyway, and so they think they need to pay for the tax cut. How are they going to pay for it? By cutting programs that everyday Americans rely on and by socking families and businesses with a $6 trillion tariff tax increase imposed purely to fund a tax cut for Donald Trump and his friends. That's what we're going to fight against in this budget. And in the same way that we succeeded by getting Republicans to vote with us against the Canadian tariffs a few days ago, it is my hope that when we get to the end of this process, we will have some Republican colleagues in this House and the next who will stand up against a president who thinks one man can shatter the economy and impose costs on everyday people to benefit himself and his friends. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.